What I'm going to get to do here a little bit is, as we kick ourselves off here today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this conference came to be, what we're trying to accomplish, kind of what our core hypothesis is. I like to use that word hypothesis, right? Because we're all just figuring this stuff out as we go a little bit. And then I'll set up the day and I'll talk about the speakers and what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and all that kind of stuff. So again, just super awesome to have everybody here. So the ElevateAgile story, right? The reason why we started talking about this a couple years ago, the reason why we started this conference, the reason why we started down this line of content was because I was out talking to people who were interested in doing Agile transformation work. I was talking to people that might have called Leading Agile and wanted to hire us or something. And I always thought that I talked a pretty good enterprise Agile game, right? Because ever since I've been in this space doing this kind of work, excuse me, everything for me was about Agile at scale. It was about doing Agile in a way that really aligned with the business. And one of the things that I started to observe is that for so long, Agile had been done at the team level only, or maybe at like the department or maybe at the work group level, that it was getting very difficult to have business-focused conversations about agility. And when we did this first conference 2 years ago, when we kicked this thing off, we actually suffered from the same thing. It was really fascinating because you're trying to talk about what does it take to achieve business agility, but in order to do that, sometimes you have to kind of start with the fundamentals and you have to start with some of the team level execution stuff. And then when you do that, you lose people, right? Because people are like, well, that's what the teams do. And I actually have this executive in this company tell me, she goes, well, yeah, that Agile stuff, that's what the teams do. We're talking about business agility. And so what I wanted to try to do was to try to create a space for a conversation where we could acknowledge the necessity of Agile and Agile teams at like the work surface level, but somehow bring the conversation up and start talking about like, how do we get the actual enterprise, the business itself, operating with agility? And so what we're gonna try to do here is I talk about Agile over the last 20 years. I wanna talk a little bit about the evolution of the thinking behind this and kind of what we're learning as an industry. And to do that, I'm going to start with this quote. And this quote is from Dennis Stevens. We were talking about like how we wanted to set up our day together. And one of the things that Dennis said, and Dennis is going to get to talk a little bit here later on today, and you guys will enjoy that. One of the things that he said was super interesting is he goes, the only valid strategy is to become a firm that can execute rapidly shifting strategies. And we've seen this through the pandemic. It's like so many different organizations had to go to remote work. Some companies had to go from making auto parts to making respirators and things. Business strategies pivoted all over the place. And so part of what we're trying to talk about here a little bit is how do you build the kinds of organizations that can rapidly respond to change, okay? And a lot of that has to do with how do we structure teams, how do we deal with dependencies, how do we align the business in the delivery organization to value, how do we orchestrate, how do we govern, how do we do all those kinds of things. And so that's the conversation that we're setting up today. One of the other things that I talk about a lot, that I feel very passionate about, is this idea that we as a community need to start to think about how to separate some concerns in the conversation as well. A lot of times we think about Agile as a set of practices. I'd like to broaden that definition and start to think about Agile as a new kind of operating model. We talk about a system of delivery, and we have the operating model that leads to agility. But then we also have this idea of how do you transform the organization into that new operating model. So we talk about system of delivery versus system of transformation. We talk about the idea of system of continuous improvement. So once you're in the new Agile operating model, once you've transformed into that, how do you continue to evolve and adapt that over time? And so as we think about how to step into this conversation, there's a couple of things that I think are incredibly fundamental to be able to get the attention and sustain the attention of the organization. First and foremost is that anything that we do from a business transformation perspective has to be anchored into measurable value. Some of the value that we talk about quite a bit is things like predictability, the ability to make and meet commitments, the ability to lower costs and to do things more efficiently, to make sure that we're working on the highest value things all the time, that we can deliver with quality, that we can innovate, that we can build the right products that our clients want. And so this idea of making sure that as we lead these kinds of changes organizationally, that we are focused on measurable, tangible business performance. It's never Agile for the sake of Agile. The next thing we're going to talk about is we want to have the ability to measure progress of a transformation. We think a lot about the idea of leading indicators and lagging indicators. What are the measurable, tangible, outcomes that we want to track to? How do we know that these changes that we're making organizationally are actually leading to the business outcomes that we want? And are we able to actually prove that we're getting the results that we desire? Right? All of those things are super critical. So we're having this conversation about what does it mean to actually be an organization that can pivot and respond to new strategies, but we're oftentimes making multi-year investments to get there. Right? It takes a while to begin to untangle an organization and to make it be this kind of a thing, right? So we have to have strategies that enable us to track to the value that we're trying to achieve. So oftentimes, the reason why business agility is failing in the marketplace right now is because we are fundamentally just thinking about it from the perspective of process, rather than actual meaningful organizational change, right? We're just talking about the idea of having an agile business model is only part of what we're trying to do. We have to have a reliable way of getting there, and we have to have the ability to adapt the model on the backside. Okay, so these are some of the key fundamental things that we're trying to accomplish. So what I want to do is I want to step back a little bit into the history of how I see our community and our movement. And I want to establish a base for a conversation so that we can start to assume some of the fundamentals. We can take some of the fundamental team level stuff off the table and start to really elevate the conversation and talk about, well, once we've built this reliable system of delivery that we can delegate into, how do we start to teach the business how to exploit the system of delivery and maximize its economic value in market? Okay? So this is like when we talk about system of delivery at the team level. And so we're going to start for just a minute talking about teams. And then once we're done talking about teams, we're going to try to leave that part of the conversation aside. It's going to come up a little bit earlier on some of Anita's talks and Melissa's talks because it's almost unavoidable. But I want to set context for why we're having this conversation. So when we think about a system of delivery, everybody here, if you're in this room, you're absolutely familiar with Scrum, extreme programming, things like that. The original Agile systems of delivery were basically small teams of 6 to 8 people operating off of very clear backlogs, able to produce a working test and increment of product at the end of every sprint. Okay, we're trying to take the word software out because software is where Agile came from, but we're using Agile in lots of different contexts. Manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, gosh, I'm just trying to think like fast food restaurants, like hotel chains, marketing, rebranding. There's Agile is everywhere. But the original Agile operating model was this idea of 6 or 8 people operating off of a clear backlog that had everything and everyone necessary to be able to deliver that working, tested, incremented product. And when I got involved in this field probably almost 20 years ago now, I went out and I got my first like real Agile job probably about 13 years ago. I was working for a company here in Atlanta called Version 1. And I was walking into these different companies that were attempting to adopt Agile, and they were attempting to install the Version 1 software. And what I found, like the first key insight for me in this industry that I thought was a huge miss, was the idea that we couldn't form teams the right way. And then even if we could form teams the right way, most teams weren't operating off of clear, well-articulated backlogs. They couldn't actually produce a working, tested, validatable, potentially shippable increment of product at the end of the sprint. And I remember thinking, I would go into these companies and I would be like, well, how in the world is anything with team level Agile going to work if we can't fundamentally get the kinds of teams in place that are necessary to deliver with agility? Because everything in Agile is about, and even the foundation of business agility, right, is about this team that can put things in front of a customer on regular intervals. And so my initial insight was, this isn't about teaching people how to do Scrum or SAFe or whatever. It's really fundamentally a business architecture problem. It's really a teaming strategy problem. And so Dennis had come out of the Microsoft business architecture practice, and he and I were in our early stages of our collaboration together. And we had this core insight is that organizing around the business architecture was really the starting place hypothesis for how we wanted to form teams at scale. Okay, and so that story's evolved over time. We're going to talk a little bit about it. The idea of like you start off organizing around the business architecture, then we're going to talk about some strategies for how to realign the business architecture and architect the organization around the value that it delivers, moving to value streams, things like that. That's not an easy thing for most large organizations to do, is organize around value streams. Okay, so Chris, when he gets here this afternoon, is going to talk a little bit about how you start to make that transformation from business architecture aligned to value stream aligned. But that was our starting place, right? Because we were hunting for ways of forming teams, because the idea of products in a lot of organizations isn't incredibly clear. So that was kind of like the first thing. Like everything really else kind of derived from that we're going to talk about, because at the point that you start to think about this idea of teams, backlogs, working tested product, we have to get the teams right. We have to get the teams organized around the right things. And then you have to figure out how to feed those teams backlogs on regular intervals, because the whole holy grail, the fundamental underpinnings of business agility is the idea of, if I can break the work into small pieces, I can have dedicated autonomous teams delivering the work, and I can put the product in front of the customer on regular intervals, I win. So everything else you do around that, how you govern the flow of value across multiple teams, how you build CI/CD pipelines, how you do DevOps, right? Everything else derives from that core first principle. And so it's super foundational, but oftentimes we get stuck in that part of the conversation because most people are not doing that incredibly well. In most organizations that we go into, it's amazing. We've been doing Agile for 20 years now, and it's still not incredibly well understood. And I think a large part of the reason why it's not understood is because people can't see a path for how to get there, right? So where things kind of evolved from there, I remember, gosh, it probably had to have been 15 years ago when Dean Leffingwell wrote his first book. I think it was called Scaling Software Agility, which was the early book around SAFe. And at the time, I remember reading that going, man, that's the book I wish I would have wrote. Because what Dean did, what was really cool, is that he articulated a strategy for what do I do when I align multiple teams that have dependencies between them, and I have to deliver something that is not on the order of magnitude of several 6 to 8 people teams, but we're talking about maybe hundreds of people, potentially even geographically dispersed. So Dean was the first person, really, in my view, that articulated a strategy for how to do that. And it was really powerful. And I don't happen to be a SAFe aficionado. It's not really our thing. It's not Leading Agile's thing. It's not my thing. But there's a fundamental reference architecture underneath SAFe, the idea of multi-tier models, the idea of teaming strategies, the idea of figuring out how to deal with dependencies, how to get these release trains and things like that going, that are really fundamentally sound. The methodology that rides on top of that reference architecture, I think, is over-prescriptive sometimes. But what we started to see, again, roughly around 10 years ago, was this move or this recognition industry-wise that team-level Agile was insufficient to solve the bigger problems in larger companies. And so people started writing about stuff. So then we saw SAFe emerge, we saw large-scale Scrum emerge, disciplined Agile delivery from Scott Ambler. There's the work that Al Shalloway was doing with net objectives that became part of PMI's Flex model. The PMI ACP certification emerged, right? There's a lot of things that were going on during that time. And I had this opportunity. I was out, I think Dennis and I were out in Fort Collins, Colorado at a Lean conference, and Dean was there. And one of the things that I shared with Dean was that while I thought the model was sound, I was concerned that we weren't giving people guidance on strategies for how to form teams, right? The things we were just talking about, and then how to progressively kind of peel apart the organization. And Dean's comment to me was, I think that's out of scope. That's kind of the domain of consultants. And I went, fascinating. Because I think there's something in that transformation journey that is fundamentally repeatable. And we're going to talk about some of the elements of it that we believe to be repeatable. But this idea that the industry is now wrestling with how do we deal with larger, more complex problems, but still deliver with agility. I was talking with Carolyn Pleiss last night at dinner, and we were talking about an early engagement that we did together. And one of the things I remember telling the president, I think it was Auto Trader at the time, is, we would be halfway towards business agility if we just stop approving gigantic projects and just do things on 3-month intervals. Right? I mean, there's just huge wins in doing things in smaller batches. And so how do we deliver in smaller batches when we have to orchestrate the output of maybe hundreds of teams into an integrated deliverable, right? So we're trying to figure that out as an industry. I think we're still trying to figure that out as an industry. And so one of the things that I got really passionate about, because, about 11 years ago, I don't know if who's all aware, but we just had our 10th anniversary last year. We had a big concert last night and had a big celebration. So I don't know if anybody got to come to that last night, but it was a ton of fun. And, but we've been doing this for about 11 years now. And one of the things that we had to try to crack the code on is when you walk into a large, complex, often multinational organization, like, what is the organizing story? How are you going to start to pull apart and start to be able to form these teams? And what do you do with dependencies? And how do you deal with orchestration? And what do you do with governance and all these different things? And so where we started to see the industry kind of go was not towards how do I teach people how to do better Scrum, or how do I teach people how to do better SAFe, but how do I actually begin the process of pulling apart the organization, refactoring it so that we can create the conditions for the Agile methodologies to really start to take hold. And that was, again, a very powerful insight. So one of the things we're going to talk about as we move into the content of today is we're going to talk about this model that we invented a while ago called the 4 quadrants. And we were talking about the idea of different organizations need to be at different levels of agility. If I'm dealing with a large-scale mainframe system, very tightly coupled, monolith, that kind of a thing, that's going to only allow a certain level of agility that's really different than maybe what we can do with mobile apps, or what we can do with the web, or what we can do with distributed systems or cloud or what have you. And so we started articulating a roadmap for how do I go possibly from a monolith, a tightly coupled technology architecture with a functionally siloed organizational architecture, project-driven versus product-oriented, those kinds of things. Like, what's the process for starting to peel that apart, right? How do you tell that story? And so one of the things we talked about on top of that we have this 4 quadrants model where we talk about predictable, adaptable, emergent, convergent. We'll go into that in a little bit. But then we articulated this strategy that we called expeditions to base camps. And so we were trying to hypothesize around was, how would you begin to approach an organization, break it into thin vertical slices? It's kind of an interesting metaphor, especially if you've come out of the software world. How do you break an organization into thin vertical slices and begin to start to make systematic improvements? So we had this idea of thin vertical slices, expeditions, that were moving to these known states. And it was a powerful metaphor, right? Because what we were thinking about in our head was, if you had a group of people that were taking a journey together, you would want to get them to a known, defined place of safety, kind of let them breathe, let them rest, and then take them to the next place. And so we articulated a roadmap of 5 core base camps, and we called them, they were like described as like, we need to get the organization predictable first. And then we need to start figuring out how to reduce batch size. And then we need to figure out how to break dependencies to actually do the product extraction work, to actually begin the decoupling process. And then the idea of, how do we change the funding models associated with how project dollars come into the organization, and how do we get to the place where we start to figure out how to form teams? Then once we have organizations or teams that are funded independently, how do we begin the process of letting those teams invent and inspect and adapt a little bit more? And that was a super powerful pivot in our way of thinking about stuff. And then what was super fascinating is, just as kind of a little bit of an aside, I'm over here, we're trying to build a consultancy to do this stuff. And you realize that just like you guys are new to a lot of these ideas, a lot of the consultants that came and worked for us were new to these ideas. And so we were starting to try to figure out, how do we articulate a strategy for moving getting our consultants and our clients and everybody working together to be able to do this. And we articulated things like outcomes-based plans, and we articulated things, we created playbooks and strategies for engagement and all these kinds of neat things. And what was super cool about it is what started to emerge was a set of repeatable patterns that we could leverage and exploit across the entire portfolio of people that we were working with. And we're like, wow, like the patterns of transformation are starting to prove repeatable. Just like the patterns of organizational design were starting to become repeatable. The patterns of methodology were becoming repeatable, right? What we found is that the patterns of transformation were becoming repeatable, okay? So when we talk about like the part of the conversation, we want to figure out how to take off the table a little bit so we can start talking about higher level things. It's really these 3 circles that I think are largely, I don't want to say becoming commoditized, because people are still learning and there's a lot of the stuff that's still not being done incredibly well. But it's understood. Like, people understand the problem. 10 years ago, when I would walk into a room and say, your biggest problem is you're not forming teams the right way, people would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. We have teams all over the place. And now it's like the team problem is understood, the backlog problem is understood, the working test of software problem is understood. The idea that transformation is a journey is kind of understood, right? Might not know how to do it incredibly well, but it's an understood problem. So when we talk about elevating the conversation and starting to explore concepts of business agility, like what do you do with compliance? What do you do with funding? What do you do with enterprise architecture? What do you do with governance, right? What do you do with annual budgeting cycles? What do you do with making and meeting commitments to market, right? All these kinds of things. The thing that we have to kind of be able to assume when you're having those conversations is that this reliable system of delivery has actually been installed. So we want to be able to talk about high-level funding, governance, compliance, all those things, but none of what we want to propose here in this conversation makes a ton of sense if you don't have the kind of organization that can support that kind of governance. Okay, so the ElevateAgile story is about how do we get to a place where we can start to take these three circles for granted and say, okay, maybe it's not perfect, but we've laid this foundation. We have a reliable system of delivery that we can delegate into. We have an organization that's relatively dependency-free, that can pivot, that can adapt, that can change, that can redeploy value-focused teams to different problems as the needs of the market emerge. Like, how can we begin to take that for granted so that we can start to talk to the business about what it needs to do now to be able to exploit the new delivery capability that it has? And that's the thing. And I think part of the problem to date with trying to figure out how to engage the business is that often the delivery organization hasn't been a reliable, trusted partner. And it's not that we didn't intend to be, or it's not that we didn't want to be. It's just that the system of delivery that we were operating in didn't produce predictable results. It made it very difficult to deliver in small batches. It made it very difficult to be able to inspect and adapt in the market. It made it very difficult to be able to do product-based funding when we're in a project-oriented world. So if we were in an organizational structure, if we had a governance model, if we had metrics and controls and OKRs that actually enabled the business to operate differently, what might be available to us to be able to have a different way of interacting with our customers and markets? Right? That's a powerful question to ask, and that's the question that we're going to explore throughout the day, especially as we get into maybe late morning, early afternoon, right? That's when I think we're going to start to get things pretty interesting. So as we crack into this, like one of the things that we're going to start to explore is what does business agility start to mean as we start to move into the product organizations, we start to move into the more business focus. What does it mean to those people? How do they become part of this new agile operating model? What does the system of delivery for the business look like? How is it different than what it is we're doing today? So Dennis's talk, he's going to talk about this little thing we call the wheel. And he's just going to explore what are the different things that need to come to the table to be able to start to have these kinds of higher level conversations. One of the things that I'm most excited about, Chris Beal's going to come this afternoon, and he's going to talk about this concept that's really kind of hot off the presses for us. It's been emerging for the last couple years, and we're starting to be able to put some language around it and starting to be able to articulate it. So you'll hear us talk about organizations to summits. So we have expeditions moving to base camps, and we have organizations moving to summits. And the reason why we started peeling that apart is in the early days of us starting to try to figure out this transformation strategy, what was happening is that, Dennis or I would go in and we would have conversations, And in our head, what was happening is that we were dealing with the entirety of the delivery stack. And in our head, we were going out and we were engaging the business. And I think legitimately we were to some extent. But then we got involved with a couple of what I would call mega transformations, tens of thousands of people. And what we were learning is that certain aspects of the transformation couldn't actually happen until we got to more of a critical mass where the new way of working was actually the norm. Like you can't, for example is, you might not be able to organize around value streams until enough of the organization is capability organized. And so we started having these conversations a couple years ago with one of our larger clients where we started organizing around business capabilities. And then what we'd recognize is that the dependencies were having to get orchestrated 5 layers up in the organization because that's kind of how they were, right? And so what we learned is once we had enough of the organization operating within this new Agile operating model organized around business capabilities, we could take a step and recognize where the dependencies were weighted the strongest and start to regroup the business capabilities. And they started to look a whole lot like value streams. And that was like a really fascinating insight. We really noodled on that for a long time. We're like, what is this telling us? And the pattern that kind of started to emerge was that until we could get enough of the organization operating in this new way, we couldn't do the value stream reorganization that we kind of knew we needed to do on day one for a couple different reasons. The organization couldn't see it, the performance characteristics, the ability, the trust, all those different things weren't there. We started hitting some other things around like project funding and budgeting and things like that, where until enough of the organization was in the new operating model, you couldn't change the funding strategies. And so the mental model that kind of started to emerge is that as we were moving expeditions through base camps, we were actually going to the business. And this is kind of what was happening in practice. And we were asking for exceptions. We were basically saying, look, we're going to go build this thing over here, but we need you to give us a pass on how we're currently doing funding. Or we're going to do a pass on how we're orchestrating work or what have you, or how we're dealing with batch size or what have you. And we're operating in this realm of exceptions. But at some point, if you don't resolve the exceptions, then the operating model is incongruent with like how the business actually works. Because you can't operate under exceptions all the time. So what is the strategy? What is the transformation strategy for actually changing the business once you have enough of the organization operating in this new way? And it was, and again, right? So in true leading Agile fashion, we actually had a really cool opportunity back in, I guess it was February. I took my leadership team out. We went to Snowbird, Utah, and we got to have an exec meeting in the room where they actually signed the Agile Manifesto. That was pretty cool, right? And there was actually a little plaque that I think the Scrum Alliance had tried to put up on the wall on the actual anniversary a little bit earlier, and they hadn't hung it up. And so Alistair Coburn reached out to us, and he goes, hey, you're in that room, get them to hang up that picture. So we actually got the hotel or that we were in to actually hang up the little plaque for the signatories of the manifesto. It was very cool, like, to be in that room. Because if you look at the picture of the Agile Manifesto up on the website, there's this blurry image in the background. We were actually like standing up on that whiteboard collaborating. So we actually started talking about, we articulated this thing that we're going to share really publicly for the first time today around organizations to summits. But the idea behind organizations to summits is that we're going to create, as the organization is moving into this new operating model, what are the kinds of things that we need to do to start to resolve exceptions and to change the way the business works as we get this new operating model in place. And one of the things that's kind of cool about this, and it's a little bit on the edge here, but I don't know that we have it totally figured out yet. We have a lot of ideas, a lot of hypotheses, so we want to share them with you, and we love your feedback, candidly. Right? I mean, you have leading Agile people all around tables and things like that. I'd love to hear what you guys think. What are we missing? Help us understand, right? Because I think this is such an important concept for us to figure this out so we can start to actually make the changes organizationally that we need to make, that we've known we've needed to make for a long time, but it's been very difficult. I've seen very few organizations truly cross that chasm into business agility. And what our concern is, right, and this is the reason why we're doing this, is if we don't crack that code, it's like, where do you go from here? Like, I don't see us going back to waterfall. I don't see us going back to big batch. Like, I don't see us going back to the way software and products were built 20 years ago. So it's like, we have to figure this out, because I don't think I don't think we can go back. And so the last bit, right, this is another bit we're hunting. Brian's gonna talk a little bit about this as we start to wrap up the day. And like, what is it, like, what capabilities need to be built into an organization so that it can sustain the agility that's created, so that it can continuously maintain the business architecture and the value architecture of the organization? Like, how does it assess new strategies and change its fundamental structure, what it's deploying its people and teams to, its resources to, so that it can respond to these new market opportunities? And like a lot of things, what's really fascinating is we started working with clients, and we started talking about agile transformation offices, and we started talking about things like systems of continuous improvement. What capabilities would we need to have emerge within an organization to be able to like really do this effectively at scale? And you start involving things like change management, business architecture. And we started to think it's really like the office of the CIO kind of functions. And so part of what Brian's going to close the day with as we get to the end of this is what does an agile transformation office look like? What's its relationship to the office of the CIO, right? Those kinds of things. So that's where we're kind of headed here. And so one of the things that I think's super cool is we've been doing this, is these systems that I've been talking about, right? Systems of transformation, systems of delivery, systems of continuous improvement. As we've figured out how to start to implement this stuff, this idea of a system of transformation kind of begetting a system of delivery, and building a system of continuous improvement in parallel. And what's another interesting thing that we've seen in industry is that people are also going through like transformation fatigue. Anybody experience that in an organization? Like we feel like we've been transforming forever, right? And so like one of the things we were talking about as a team was, we can't always be in the transformation business. At some point in time, we have to figure out, even companies, like how to be in the continuous improvement business. And so we started like to talk about this idea of system of transformation begets system of continuous delivery, forms a system of continuous improvement. They work together, but at some point after the transformation, right, what we really basically have is like an in the business, on the business function, where what does it look like to continuously adapt this reliable system that we can deliver into, that is organized around its customers and markets, that is absolutely built to respond to changing market conditions. Like, how does that evolve over time, right? Super interesting questions to answer and to ask. Okay, got to ask them, I guess, before you answer them. So I got about 6 minutes left. I'm going to try to wrap this up. I'm going to tee up our day for you guys here at this point, like a little bit more, right? So what we're going to do, how we're going to unpack this. So as we orchestrated these next 7 talks, I guess 6 talks now, because I'm the first one. So as we orchestrated these 7 talks in their entirety, we wanted to tell an end-to-end story. And so the way this story is going to go is Anita is one of our product consultants. Super talented, super excited to get her up here and to talk. Is she's going to start to lay the foundation, the necessity of aligning organizations to customers and market. What does it mean to build trustworthy systems? She's going to go into more depth on our system of transformation. Then Melissa Oberg, one of our principal consultants, is going to go a little bit into the nuts and bolts of the quadrants, expeditions, base camps, lay that foundation. And the way I was kind of conceptualizing it is Anita's going to talk about the need for it, and then Melissa's going to come along and talk a little bit about how to do it. But we're still going to be in those inner three circles that we talked about. We're still at kind of the expedition to base camp level because it's fundamental, right? It's like we can't be the kind of organization that can achieve business agility if we don't have that foundational thing. So we're going to explore that for just a minute. Then things are going to get super interesting. Dennis is going to come along, and he's going to talk about this like little wheel metaphor that we have, right? And it's going to hopefully make this idea of organizing systems and processes around customers and market. It's going to make it really come alive. And he's going to talk about the exceptions that we're asking the organization to make, the things that we're leaving behind as we start to change these operating models. And he's going to create what I hope is some tension in the system that demands to be resolved. And he's going to create the case that we need to do this. And then Chris is going to come along. And what Chris is going to do is he's going to introduce the organization's to summit story. And so he's doing some really, really interesting work with one of our largest clients in this particular space. And this is in the area of pure invention right now. This is where it's super, like we don't have it totally figured out, but I think it's powerful enough and I think it's on point enough that we want to share it with you. Brian's going to come along, wrap up our day, and talk about change orchestration, playbooks, tools, metrics, reporting, right? What does it look like to sustain this system after we've built it? And the other thing we're doing, this is like an experiment on the event, is I really appreciate the folks that could actually attend in person. As you might imagine, given the pandemic and travel restrictions and things like that, a lot of people that would have loved to have been in the room with us either on a remote feed or just weren't able to make it. We actually have 2 experience reports from our clients. So we have Lockheed Martin experience report and we have a Ford Motor Company experience report. And these are some of the clients that are going through some of these changes and helping invent this organization's the summit model with us as we go down this path. And so what they've done for us, which is super cool, I'm kind of excited, a little hesitant, I don't know exactly how it's going to go, but we actually have pre-recorded talks from them. And so they're going to be on our screens talking to us because they couldn't travel in. They couldn't get like corporate, travel isn't available at the stage. So that's where we're at. That's where we're going. Any thoughts, questions before we get going? We're a small enough group, we can actually make it a little bit intimate, right? If Anita has a little bit of extra time, maybe we can take some Q&A. Got a bunch of really smart people in the room. We can just really just open this up and make it a conversation. So why don't you guys grab some coffee, about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we will get going with the rest of our show today. So we appreciate everybody being here. Thank you so much.